In the last 18 months, 11 nannies had walked out of the heavy oak doors of the Ironwood Ranch. 3 top pediatric speech therapists from out of state had surrendered, packing their bags and driving back to the city, and not a single specialist in the country could explain why a perfectly healthy 23-month-old girl refused to make a single sound. The 12th nanny had just stumbled out of the massive log and stone estate 10 minutes ago, tears streaking her dusty cheeks, swearing to the high heavens she would rather scrub floors at a truck stop diner than spend one more night under that suffocating roof. Cade Thornton did not watch her leave. He had stopped watching them leave around nanny number 6. He stood in his second-floor office, his jaw tight, a faded white scar along his left cheekbone catching the dim, amber light from the desk lamp. Outside, the Montana wind howled across 50,000 acres of prime grazing land, rattling the window panes. At 36, Cade controlled a cattle and land empire that made powerful men sweat in their tailored suits. He had broken wild mustangs, stared down blizzards, and crushed rival ranches without a second thought. And yet here he was, completely undone by silence, his daughter's silence. Emery hadn't spoken, hadn't cried out loud, hadn't laughed, hadn't made a single vocal sound since she was 5 months old. She had just stopped. The doctors had a fancy medical name for it. The therapists had notebooks full of theories. None of them had a solution. And now even the premier childcare agencies in the state had officially blacklisted his household. His estate manager, Silas, a 63-year-old former rodeo rider with a bad knee, and the only person on earth who still spoke to Cade without flinching, appeared in the doorway. The scent of pine and old leather clung to him. "Boss, I've wired every agency from here to Bozeman. No one's willing to make the drive out." Cade said nothing. He looked down at his hands, calloused hands that had built miles of barbed wire fence hands, that had ended men who tried to steal what was his, and thought about the little girl sitting upstairs on the cold hardwood floor of her nursery. She was clutching a worn-out stuffed horse that still smelled like her dead mother, crying without making a sound. Her mouth would be wide open, her tiny body shaking, and nothing coming out. Absolute silence. That was the thing about Emery's crying that wrecked him every single time. It wasn't the noise. It was the devastating absence of it, like watching someone drown behind thick, soundproof glass. He had spent a small fortune trying to fix it. He had spent 18 months failing. What Cade Thornton didn't know was that in less than 24 hours, a 27-year-old ranch supply delivery driver from the struggling side of the valley, a woman who had been orphaned at 14, who sang old country lullabies to keep herself from falling apart on her morning routes, who owned nothing, and feared no man would accidentally walk into the wrong hallway of his fortress. She would kneel in the dust in front of his daughter and do the one thing his entire cattle empire couldn't. She would finally pierce the wall of Emery's absolute silence. Let's go back to where it all started, the night the heart of the Ironwood Ranch went completely quiet. 23 months ago, Cade stood in the sterile delivery room at the county hospital. For the first time in his hard, unforgiving life, he didn't know what to do. His wife, Evelyn, lay on the hospital bed, her golden hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her bright green eyes slowly losing their light, yet her lips were still curved in a soft smile. The labor had been normal for the first 4 hours. Cade had held her hand and believed they had won. Then Emery was born, tiny and red, letting out a healthy cry that rang through the room. In that fleeting second, Cade thought he finally understood what complete unfiltered happiness felt like. But that moment lasted less than 3 minutes. The bleeding started, not the ordinary kind. Blood soaked through the stark white sheets, and the doctor's face changed from calm to ashen in a matter of seconds. Severe postpartum hemorrhage. He didn't hear the clinical terms. He only saw his wife slipping away, while his newborn daughter lay in the nurse's arms, crying as if the whole world were collapsing. They pushed Cade out into the hallway. He didn't fight them. He only stood there, his back against the cold wall, staring at the swinging doors and waiting. 47 minutes.
Sweetie.
That was the span of time before the doctor came out, removed his surgical mask, and delivered the sentence Cade would hear echoing in his head every night for the rest of his life. We did everything we could. Before they wheeled her into surgery, Evelyn had managed to grasp Cade's hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Cade promised me," she had whispered, her voice no more than a fragile breath. "Our little girl will always hear a loving voice. Don't let her grow up in silence." He promised, but Evelyn didn't hear it, her eyes closing before the words left his throat. They placed Emery in his arms at 3 in the morning. The baby looked up at her father's face with storm-gray eyes. Cade realized this was the only living being in the world who looked at him without fear. He brought her back to the ranch, hired a warm, middle-aged nanny named Martha, and paid her double the going rate. For the first 5 months, Emery developed normally. She babbled, she laughed when Silas made funny faces. Then Martha quit moving out of state with her husband. She cried as she hugged Emery goodbye, then disappeared forever. The day Martha left was the day Emery made her final sound. It took Cade a week to understand that his daughter wasn't just being a good, quiet baby. She had stopped crying, stopped laughing, stopped making any sound at all. Her infant brain had reached a simple, merciless conclusion. Whenever she bonded with someone, they disappeared. First her mother, then Martha. The only way to keep anyone from leaving was never to call for them. Silence was safe. 30 miles away from the sprawling gates of Ironwood, in a rusted, single-wide trailer parked behind a paint store, an alarm clock buzzed violently at 5 in the morning. Elara Vance slammed her hand down on the snooze button. She didn't need the alarm. Her body had been trained to wake before dawn since the fire took her parents 13 years ago. The trailer was freezing, the propane heater having given out sometime around midnight. She wrapped a thick flannel shirt over her faded t-shirt, brewed a pot of cheap bitter coffee, and pulled on her worn leather work boots. She checked her delivery clipboard. 47 stops across the county today, hauling salt licks, fencing wire, and veterinary supplies from dawn until dusk. Paid by the mile, no benefits, no sick days. Before leaving, she dialed her brother's number. Sam answered after 4 rings, sounding exhausted. "Sam, get up," Elara said, pouring her coffee into a battered thermos. "You have your agriculture economics class at 8. It's Tuesday, Elle. Class is at 9. Sam paused, the irritation fading into something heavy and scared. "Elle, the college sent the final notice. If I don't pay the $12,000 for the semester's tuition and board within 30 days, I'm suspended. I lose the farm management spot." Silence hung in the freezing trailer. $12,000. Elara looked at her banking app on her cracked phone screen. $347. That was everything she had to her name. "Don't worry," Elara said, her voice so steady it surprised her. "I'll take care of it. Just go to class." She hung up, grabbed her keys, and stepped out into the biting Montana morning. Climbing into the cab of her battered delivery truck, she turned the key in the ignition. As the old engine sputtered to life, she began to sing, softly just for herself. An old country lullaby the woman who took them in used to sing when the nightmares of the fire were too much. She had no idea that her voice was about to collide with the most powerful man in the state. Elara drove the rattling delivery truck out of the dusty lot just as the sun began to bleed orange over the jagged peaks of the mountains. She sang the old lullaby, soft and steady, a little off-rhythm in the chorus as always. It was a habit born of survival, a way to keep the crushing weight of reality, the $12,000, the failing heater, the sheer exhaustion at bay. Her 38th stop of the day brought her to a place she had only ever seen from a distance. The invoice on her clipboard read Ironwood Ranch, deliver to rear service entrance, do not use main drive. Elara turned off the county highway, onto a private paved road lined with ancient towering cottonwoods. Instinctively, she eased her foot off the gas pedal. The Ironwood estate wasn't just a ranch, it was a fortress. The main house was a staggering structure of hand-hewn logs, river stone, and massive glass windows that glared down at the valley like watchful eyes. Fences higher and thicker than standard livestock wire bordered the property, and as she approached the heavy iron gates, 2 men on horseback wearing dusters and carrying rifles in their saddle scabbards eyed her with cold suspicion. She rolled down her window, handing the barcode scanner to one of the men. "Vance Supply," Elara said, her voice betraying none of the intimidation she felt. 3 crates of equine medical supplies and supplements. The man didn't say a word. He merely tipped his hat an inch and gestured toward a gravel path branching off toward the rear of the massive house. Alara parked near the service porch, hoisted the heavy wooden crates onto her shoulder one by one, and carried them into the mudroom. An older woman in an apron met her, pointed to a corner, and told her to wait for Silas, the estate manager, to sign the paperwork. Left alone in a kitchen larger than her entire trailer, Alara stood with her hands shoved into the pockets of her denim jacket. The kitchen was immaculate gleaming copper pots, a massive butcher block island industrial stoves, but it lacked the scent of a real home. No smell of baking bread, no lingering aroma of bacon grease. It was perfectly coldly sterile. Then she heard it, a sound from upstairs drifting faintly through the thick timber ceiling. It was a steady rhythmic tapping, thump, 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 soft and patient, as if whoever was making it had done it 1,000 times before and would keep doing it until anyone listened. 13 years of raising her traumatized younger brother had honed Alara's instincts to a razor's edge. She knew the difference between the sound of play and the sound of distress. That tapping was a distress signal. Alara glanced around. The kitchen was empty. Ignoring the strict instructions to wait, she slipped out into the wide, dimly lit hallway and followed the sound up a sweeping wooden staircase. The second floor was carpeted in thick plush rugs, the walls lined with Western landscape paintings and heavy bronze sconces. The tapping was clearer now, coming from the last door at the end of the hall, which was cracked open just enough to let a sliver of daylight spill out. Alara stopped at the doorway and looked inside. A little girl was sitting in the middle of the floor on a braided rug. She was wearing a pale yellow dress, her dark curls sticking to her flushed, tear-stained cheeks. In her tiny hands, she clutched an old, threadbare stuffed horse. She was tapping its wooden hoof against the floorboards, over and over. Not in anger, not in play, but with a desperate rhythmic necessity. Alara understood instantly. The little girl was making a sound because it was the only sound she felt safe making. She was using the toy to tell the massive empty house that she was still there. Alara didn't step into the room. She knew better than to crowd a frightened child. Instead, she slowly lowered herself to the floor, sitting cross-legged just outside the doorway in the hall. She leaned her head against the doorframe, closed her eyes, and began to sing. It was the same old country lullaby she had sung in the truck. Her voice wasn't classically beautiful. It was rough around the edges from years of breathing in road dust, but it was incredibly warm, steady, and grounded. It was a voice that promised safety. The tapping stopped. Complete silence swallowed the room. Alara didn't stop singing, nor did she open her eyes to look directly at the child. She just let the melody flow into the room, like a gentle breeze pushing open a heavy door. After a long minute, she heard the faint rustle of fabric on the carpet, the sound of tiny knees crawling closer. Alara slowly opened her eyes. Emery had crawled all the way to the doorway, dragging the stuffed horse behind her. Her storm gray eyes were fixed on Alara, wide and unblinking, as if she were trying to determine if this singing woman was a mirage. The child reached the edge of Alara's scuffed work boots, stopped, and looked up into her face. Emery opened her mouth. Her little lips trembled. Her throat strained visibly, fighting against an invisible barrier that had locked her voice away for a year and a half. It was tiny, fragile, barely louder than a breath, but it was real. Alara didn't gasp. She didn't shower the child with overwhelming praise. She just offered a soft, easy smile, as if this happened every day. "Well, hello there, little bird," she whispered. "You've got a mighty pretty voice." Down in the security office, Cassidy, the tough, eagle-eyed woman who ran Ironwood's surveillance, nearly dropped her coffee mug. She slapped the intercom button connected to Cade's office. "Boss, second floor, Emery's hallway, now!" Cade burst out of his office, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy leather holster at his hip. He took the stairs 2 at a time, moving with lethal, silent speed. He didn't ask questions. Cassidy only sounded that urgent when there was an immediate threat to the ranch. He rounded the corner of the second-floor hallway and stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting on the floor outside the nursery was a woman in a faded denim jacket, her hair tied back in a messy braid, gently humming. And sitting right in front of her, leaning her small hands on the woman's knee, was Emery. As Cade stood frozen in the shadows, he watched his daughter open her mouth again. Ma." The sound hit Cade Thornton with the force of a physical blow. He reached out his calloused hand, gripping the rough-hewn log wall to keep his knees from buckling. He had paid fortunes to specialists, spent sleepless nights reading medical journals, and watched his daughter cry in absolute silence until it broke his spirit. Now a delivery driver in scuffed boots had just walked into his house, sat in the dirt of his hallway, and pulled a sound from his daughter's throat with nothing but a song. He stood there, the ruthless cattle baron of Montana, listening to the tiny, beautiful sound of his daughter's voice, and felt a heavy, suffocating block of ice in his chest begin to crack. Cade stayed in the shadows of the hallway for 15 minutes just listening. He watched the delivery woman slowly offer her hand, and he watched, stunned, as Emery placed her tiny palm against it. Only when Silas came trudging up the back stairs holding the signed delivery clipboard did Cade finally step forward. Alara heard the heavy, measured thud of cowboy boots on the hardwood. She gently pulled her hand back, stood up, and brushed the dust from her jeans. When she turned, she found herself face to face with a man who seemed to take up all the air in the hallway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern, weather-beaten face and eyes exactly the same shade of stormy gray as the little girl's. "What were you doing with my daughter?" Cade's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a low, dangerous rumble that commanded immediate obedience. Alara didn't flinch. She had grown up dealing with rough men at feed stores and loading docks. "I heard her crying," Alara said evenly, "or trying to. I just sat down and sang. I didn't touch her until she came to me." She made a sound. It wasn't a question. Cade stared at her with an intensity that made Alara want to step back, though she held her ground. "She did," Alara nodded. "She's got a voice in there, just needs a reason to use it that doesn't feel scary." Cade looked from Alara to Emery, who was now hiding behind the doorframe, peeking out at them. "Do you know that a dozen highly trained professionals haven't been able to get her to do that for a year and a half?" Alara shrugged slightly, adjusting the collar of her jacket. "I don't know much about professionals, mister. I just know kids. I got my signature from Silas, so I'll be out of your hair. I have 9 more stops before sundown." She turned to walk past him. Cade didn't step aside. "Quit your delivery route," Cade said, his voice flat, a business proposition delivered like an order. "Come work here. Be Emery's nanny. I'll pay you 5 times whatever the supply company is giving you. Cash weekly." Alara stopped. She looked at the man's expensive boots, the custom leather holster at his hip, the sheer, intimidating wealth of the house around her. Then she looked at his eyes, hard, desperate, used to buying whatever they couldn't conquer. "No," Alara said firmly. Cade's brow furrowed. It was a subtle shift, but the air in the hallway grew noticeably colder. "I don't usually hear that word, Miss Vance, Alara Vance," she replied, her chin lifting defiantly. "And today's a good day to learn it. Your house is a fortress. You've got armed men at the gates. I don't know what kind of trouble you're involved in, Mr. Thornton, but I don't want any part of it. I've got my own life to worry about." She stepped around him, walked swiftly down the stairs, handed Silas the clipboard, and drove her rattling truck out of the ironwood gates without checking her rearview mirror. She didn't notice the sleek black business card Silas had quietly slipped into the pocket of her jacket until she was halfway across the county. That evening, reality caught up to Alara with brutal efficiency. She parked the truck behind Mabel's diner, her bones aching from 14 hours of hauling feed bags. Inside the diner was empty, the neon open sign buzzing faintly. Mabel, a fierce woman in her 60s, who had taken Alara and Sam in when they had nowhere else to go, was sitting at the counter staring at a stack of bills. "Bank called," Mabel said without looking up, her usually booming voice sounding small and tired. "They're foreclosing on the diner at the end of the month, Elle. I can't keep up with the loan. I'm sorry, honey. I know I promised to help with Sam's tuition." Alara's chest tightened. She walked to the back room, sat on her narrow cot, and pulled out her phone. Sam's text was glowing on the screen. Financial aid office denied the appeal. "I have to pack up my dorm by Friday. 12,000 for Sam, the bank note for Mabel." Alara sat in the dark room listening to the hum of the refrigerator and felt the walls closing in until she couldn't breathe. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the crisp black card. Just a phone number, no name. She closed her eyes, remembering the tiny, terrified girl tapping the wooden horse against the floor. She remembered the sound of that fragile breaking 18 months of silence. Alara dialed the number. Cade answered on the second ring. I'll take the job, Alara said, her voice shaking slightly before she steadied it. But I have conditions. I need $15,000 in advance, tomorrow, and I need to know why your ranch looks more like a military compound than a cattle operation. Silence hung on the line. Then Cade's deep voice answered, Be at the gates at 8 tomorrow morning. I'll have the money, and I'll give you your answers. The next morning, Alara moved into the east wing of the Ironwood estate. Her room was massive, featuring a stone fireplace and a large window overlooking the rolling pastures. Cade met her in the grand living room, handing her a thick manila envelope. I run the largest cattle operation in the state, Miss Vance, Cade said, pouring a cup of black coffee. I also buy up distressed land water rights and supply chains. Some people don't like my methods. Some people want to take what I've built by force. The security is to make sure they can't. But my enemies stay outside those gates. Inside this house, you and my daughter are perfectly safe. Alara took the envelope, feeling the heavy weight of the cash that would save her brother's future and Mabel's diner. I'm not easily scared, Mr. Thornton. I can see that, Cade murmured, taking a sip of his coffee. That night, Alara didn't sleep. The massive house was too quiet, the shadows too long. Around midnight, she heard it, the faint rhythmic tapping from down the hall. She threw off her covers, walked barefoot down the cold hardwood corridor, and stopped outside Emery's door. She didn't intrude. She sat on the floor, leaned her back against the wall, and began to sing the country lullaby. The tapping stopped. A moment later, she heard the soft rustle of movement, and then a tiny, hesitant sound drifted through the crack in the door, a soft, clear hum in the dark. Alara smiled, leaning her head back against the wood. The battle for the little girl's voice had officially begun. Alara did not implement any of the rigid schedules or clinical exercises the high-priced therapists had left behind in thick binders. She simply existed in Emery's world, steady and unbothered, like the ancient cottonwoods lining the ranch driveway. For the first few days, Alara just sat on the floor of the nursery, a respectful distance away, and sang. She didn't crowd the little girl. She didn't demand eye contact or try to force a breakthrough. She merely offered her presence, a warm and constant grounding force in a house that felt too large and too cold. By the fourth day, Emery crawled into Alara's lap on her own accord. It was a quiet surrender. Alara simply wrapped her arms around the small, trembling body, resting her chin on Emery's dark curls, and kept humming. As the weeks bled into a slow, rhythmic routine, Alara began to introduce the little girl to the sprawling life of Ironwood Ranch. She wrapped Emery in a thick wool blanket and carried her out to the massive timber-framed stables. For a child who had been trapped inside the sterile walls of a nursery, the barn was an overwhelming symphony of life. The rich, earthy smell of sweetgrass hay and oiled saddle leather, the low, rumbling nickers of the quarter horses, the rhythmic thud of hooves against the packed dirt floor. Alara walked her down the aisle, talking to her in a steady conversational tone, pointing out the barn swallows darting in the rafters and letting Emery touch the velvet soft nose of an old gentle mare. This here is Daisy, Alara would murmur, guiding the child's tiny hand. She's older than dirt, but she's the sweetest thing on four legs. You don't have to be scared of her. She's just saying hello. Emery didn't respond with words, but her storm-gray eyes widened, taking it all in, and slowly the invisible knot in her throat began to loosen. She started making small experimental noises, a soft when a horse snorted, a tiny baw when Silas dropped a bucket of feed. Alara treated every sound with absolute normalcy. She didn't gasp or celebrate excessively, knowing that drawing too much attention might send the frightened child scrambling back behind her walls. Cade watched this slow resurrection from a distance. He would stand on the second-floor balcony, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, watching Alara carry his daughter across the frost-tipped grass. He watched through the crack of the kitchen door as Alara balanced Emery on her hip, stirring a pot of stew with one hand, while effortlessly explaining the difference between carrots and potatoes. He saw the life bleeding back into his daughter's eyes, and a profound aching gratitude took root in his chest. The breakthrough came on a crisp Thursday afternoon. The Grand Ranch kitchen was bathed in the warm golden light of the fading sun. Alara had Emery sitting in a high chair carved from solid hickory, a bowl of warm apple cinnamon oatmeal cooling on the butcher block counter. Alara sat on a stool beside her, a spoon in her hand, casually telling a story about a wild barn cat she had managed to tame back when she was a teenager. That cat was meaner than a rattlesnake. Alara chuckled softly, scooping up a small amount of oatmeal. If you even looked at him wrong, he'd hiss and run under the porch. But I just started leaving a little bowl of milk out every night. I didn't try to grab him. I just sat on the steps and let him figure out I wasn't going anywhere. Alara brought the spoon to Emery's mouth. The little girl opened up, swallowed the oatmeal, and then stopped. She didn't open her mouth for the next bite. Instead, Emery looked directly at Alara. Those gray eyes, usually so distant and guarded, were entirely focused, her little brow furrowed in intense concentration. Her tiny lips parted, and her throat worked frantically, trying to push something out past the heavy barrier of her trauma. Alara's heart did a slow, heavy roll in her chest, but she kept her face perfectly relaxed. She didn't lean forward, she just smiled warmly, offering the spoon again. Ma! Ma! The spoon slipped from Alara's fingers, clattering loudly against the granite countertop and splattering a drop of oatmeal onto her denim apron. It wasn't a random babble. It wasn't a meaningless hum. It was two distinct, deliberate syllables, a complete word spoken with absolute clarity in the quiet kitchen. Mama. Emery repeated it, her voice trembling, but gaining strength, a desperate, beautiful urgency lighting up her face. She reached her small, sticky hands out toward Alara. Mama, Mama. Tears blurred Alara's vision instantly. She didn't cry out of joy, though her heart was soaring. She cried because she understood the devastating weight of that word. Emery wasn't calling her mother in the literal sense. Emery's infant mind had taken the concept of safety, of warmth, of the singing voice in the dark that promised never to leave, and assigned it the only word she knew for it. Mama. It was a word that belonged to a ghost, to Evelyn, the woman Alara had never met but mourned in that exact moment. Alara pulled Emery out of the high chair and crushed the little girl to her chest, burying her face in Emery's dark curls, her shoulders shaking as the tears finally spilled over. Outside the heavy, swinging doors of the kitchen, Cade Thornton stood paralyzed. He had come down the hall to ask Silas a question about the northern fence line, but his boots had stopped dead at the sound of the spoon hitting the counter, and then he heard it, the word he would have traded his entire empire to hear. Mama. Cade leaned heavily against the log-paneled wall, the breath rushing out of his lungs. A brutal war raged in his chest, pure blinding joy that the silence was finally broken, and an agonizing, razor-sharp grief that sliced him to the bone because his daughter's first word wasn't Dada, it wasn't his name, it was the name of his dead wife spoken to a delivery driver from the other side of the valley. He closed his eyes, fighting the burning sting behind his eyelids. Cade Thornton did not cry. He hadn't shed a tear since the monitors flatlined in that hospital room, but as he stood in the hallway listening to Alara softly weeping and holding his daughter as she babbled her newfound word, Cade let one single silent tear slip down his weathered face. He turned and walked quietly back upstairs. He would not intrude. He would just be grateful. It happened in quiet, imperceptible shifts, the way the harsh Montana winter slowly surrenders to the spring thaw. The rigid professional boundaries Cade had constructed around himself began to weather and crack. The first real crack appeared at 2 a.m. on a restless Tuesday, Cade unable to shut his mind off from the cattle market reports and the lingering ghosts of his past, walked down to the kitchen for a glass of bourbon. He found the lights already dim, and Alara sitting at the massive island nursing a mug of chamomile tea. She wore a faded flannel shirt over her pajamas, her hair falling in a loose, messy braid over her shoulder. She looked exhausted, having spent the last 2 hours walking the floor with a teething, fussy Emery. They looked at each other across the expanse of the kitchen. Usually Cade would have nodded, poured his drink, and retreated to his office, but tonight the heavy silence of the ranch felt different. He poured his bourbon and sat on the stool opposite her. "You look like hell, Vance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that lacked its usual sharp edge. Alara offered a tired, wry smile. "You're a real charmer, Thornton. No wonder you live out here in the middle of nowhere." Cade took a slow sip of the amber liquid. For reasons he couldn't entirely explain, the exhaustion in her eyes made him want to speak, or maybe it was just the witching hour, the time of night when the truth slips out easier. They talked. Ilara told him about the fire that had consumed her childhood home, the smell of smoke that still haunted her dreams, and the terrifying weight of pulling her younger brother out of a ground floor window while the roof collapsed behind them. She talked about Mabel, the gruff diner owner who took them in, and the 13 years she had spent breaking her back to make sure Sam had a shot at a life that didn't involve hauling feed sacks. Cade listened. He didn't offer empty pity or try to fix it with his checkbook. He just sat there swirling the bourbon in his glass and looked at her with a profound, quiet respect. Then Cade told her about Evelyn. He didn't give the sanitized version, he gave the ranch hands. He talked about how she had been the only person in his life who wasn't intimidated by his wealth or his ruthless reputation. He spoke of the blood on the hospital floor, the agonizing 47 minutes in the hallway, and the crushing realization that he had built a kingdom but couldn't save his queen. She was the only person who looked at me without fear, Cade murmured, staring into his glass, until Emery, and now... He stopped. The words hung in the quiet kitchen, and now you. He didn't say it aloud, and Ilara didn't press him, but the implications settled between them, heavy and undeniable. The fragile bridge they built that night was tested in fire a week later. A sudden violent winter storm had rolled down from the mountains, burying ironwood under 2 feet of snow and cutting off the main roads. That same night, Emery spiked a terrifying fever. Ilara woke to the baby monitor crackling with the sound of ragged, labored breathing. She bolted out of bed and ran down the hall to the nursery. Emery was burning up her skin, flushed crimson, her tiny body trembling violently. Ilara scooped her up and yelled for Silas, who immediately hammered on Cade's bedroom door. The doctor was 30 miles away, and the roads were impassable. They were completely on their own. For the next 6 hours, the 3 adults functioned as a desperate, synchronized unit. Cade chopped ice from the frozen water troughs outside, while Ilara and Silas applied cool compresses to Emery's forehead and chest. The child's temperature climbed dangerously high. She cried weakly, a raspy, painful sound, her small hands clinging to Ilara's shirt with a terrifying, desperate grip. Cade felt a sickening wave of helplessness wash over him. He was a man used to controlling his environment, a man who could solve any problem with grit or money. But standing in the nursery watching his daughter burn with fever, he was paralyzed. He paced the floor like a caged wolf, his face pale, his jaw locked tight. "She's going to be okay, Cade," Ilara said softly, looking up from where she sat rocking Emery in the corner chair. It was the first time she had ever used his first name. "I've got her. She's strong." Cade stopped pacing. He knelt beside the rocking chair, his large, rough hands gently enveloping Emery's tiny, feverish foot. He stayed right there on his knees for hours, watching the slow, agonizing rise and fall of his daughter's chest, drawing strength from Ilara's unshakable calm. Just before dawn, the fever finally broke. Emery's breathing leveled out into a deep, peaceful sleep, the flush leaving her cheeks. The oppressive tension in the room shattered, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Ilara leaned her head back against the wingback chair, closing her eyes. Emery was curled securely against her chest, her small fists still clutching the fabric of Ilara's shirt. Within minutes, the sheer emotional toll dragged Ilara into a heavy sleep. Cade stood up slowly, his joints popping in protest. He walked over to the crib, picked up a soft knitted blanket, and draped it carefully over Ilara and his sleeping daughter. As he tucked the edge of the blanket around Ilara's shoulder, his knuckles brushed against her cheek. He didn't pull back immediately. His fingers lingered, tracing the soft line of her jaw, gently moving a stray lock of hair away from her face. It was a touch so light, so achingly tender, it felt like a confession. Ilara wasn't fully asleep. She felt the warmth of his rough hand against her skin. Her breath hitched slightly in her throat, but she didn't open her eyes. She didn't want to break the fragile spell. She lay there in the quiet nursery, listening to the howling Montana wind outside, and felt the unmistakable, terrifying realization that she was falling in love with a man whose world she didn't belong to. Cade withdrew his hand, stepping back into the shadows. Neither of them spoke, but as the pale morning light broke over the snow-covered ranch, the thick defensive fences they had built around their hearts had irrevocably come down. Judd Miller was not a man who understood patience. As the foreman for the neighboring Blackwood Ranch, a corporate-backed operation desperate to swallow Ironwood's superior water rights, Judd had spent the last 2 years probing Cade Thornton's defenses. He had cut fences, poisoned water holes, and bribed county inspectors, but Cade's iron grip on the valley had never slipped. Until now, Judd had eyes in the local town. He had heard the whispers that the ruthless cattle baron was softening, spending less time at the railhead and more time at the estate with his mute daughter and the new nanny. To a predator like Judd, a distracted kingpin was a vulnerable one. He didn't want to kill Cade. He wanted to terrorize him, to break his spirit and force him to sell the water rights, to keep his family safe. He waited for a moonless Friday night. At 10:00 p.m., a panicked call came through the Ironwood radio frequency. A massive brush fire had supposedly broken out near the northern boundary, threatening a herd of 2,000 prime Angus cattle. Cade didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and his rifle. He took Cassidy and 20 of his best men, leaving only Silas and 2 perimeter guards to watch the main house. "I'll be back before dawn," Cade told Alara, pausing in the hallway. The look in his eyes was fierce protective. "Lock the doors." He didn't know the call was a complete fabrication. The fire was nothing more than a few burning tires stacked in a ravine designed specifically to pull the wolf away from the den. 30 minutes after the taillights of Cade's trucks disappeared over the ridge, the power to the Ironwood estate was abruptly cut. Ilara was lying in bed listening to the wind when the heavy silence of the house was shattered by the sharp, terrifying crack of a gunshot from the front gate. Her blood ran cold. She didn't freeze. 13 years of survival instinct took over. She threw off the blankets, ran barefoot across the freezing hardwood floor, and bolted down the hall to the nursery. Emery was sitting up in her crib, her eyes wide in the pitch-black room, her tiny body rigid with fear at the sound of the gunshot. Alara scooped the child into her arms. "I've got you, baby," she whispered, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "You're safe. Mama's here." Heavy, muddy boots pounded against the back porch. The sound of glass shattering echoed from the first-floor kitchen. There were men inside the house. Alara frantically scanned the nursery. The second-story window was too high to jump from with a toddler. The hallway was a death trap. Her eyes landed on the massive antique oak wardrobe in the corner of the room. It was thick, heavy, and tucked into the shadows. She quickly opened the heavy wooden doors, pushing aside the tiny dresses and winter coats. She placed Emery inside, pressing the worn, stuffed horse into her small hands. Alara knelt, looking directly into the terrified gray eyes of the little girl. "Emery, listen to me," Alara whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "You stay right here. You hide with your horsey. Do not make a sound no matter what happens. Mama is right outside." Alara closed the wardrobe doors, plunging the child into darkness. Then she turned around and stood squarely in front of it, placing her back against the oak wood, spreading her arms wide as if she could physically shield the entire world from what was coming. Heavy footsteps thundered up the wooden staircase. The nursery door was violently kicked open, the wood splintering off the hinges. 2 men stepped into the room. Their faces were obscured by bandanas, and the beams of their heavy flashlights swept erratically through the dark. The blinding light finally stopped, fixing squarely on Alara. She stood barefoot in her thin sleep shirt, her hair wild, her chin lifted high. She had no weapon, she had no backup, but she had the ferocious, unbreakable will of a woman protecting her child. "If you want to touch the little girl," Alara said, her voice shaking with adrenaline but cold as mountain ice, "you are going to have to kill me first." The lead man chuckled a harsh, ugly sound. He racked the slide of his pistol and took a heavy step forward, and in that exact moment the silence of the Ironwood Ranch was shattered by a sound so raw, so deafening it seemed to shake the very timber of the walls. From inside the wardrobe, Emery screamed. It wasn't a whimper. It wasn't a tiny It was a primal, ear-piercing scream of absolute, unadulterated terror. The invisible wall in the child's throat had burst open under the sheer pressure of fear. The scream was so sudden and shockingly loud that both attackers flinched instinctively, taking a step back. That 1 second of hesitation cost them everything. A deafening boom echoed from the hallway. The plaster above the doorway exploded into a cloud of white dust. Silas stood at the threshold, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, holding a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun braced tightly against his shoulder. "Drop 'em!" Silas roared, racking the shotgun with a lethal metallic clack. Before the intruders could raise their weapons or surrender, the sound of screeching tires tore through the front yard. Cade Thornton had realized the fire was a diversion the moment he smelled the burning rubber at the ravine. He had driven his truck back at 90 miles an hour, taking the dirt roads blindly in the dark. Heavy boots hit the stairs with terrifying speed. Cade burst into the nursery like a force of nature, his Colt .45 drawn, his eyes burning with a murderous rage. The two intruders dropped their weapons, immediately raising their hands in desperate surrender, but Cade barely looked at them. Cassidy and the ranch hands poured into the room behind him, violently throwing the men to the floor and dragging them out into the hall. Cade's eyes locked onto Alara. She was still standing, with her arms spread wide in front of the wardrobe, hyperventilating, tears streaming down her pale face. Cade holstered his weapon and fell to his knees in front of the oak doors. Alara stepped aside, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Cade slowly pulled the heavy doors open. Emery was curled in the far corner, her face buried in the stuffed horse, sobbing loudly, gulping for air. When the light hit her, she looked up. She saw the broad shoulders and the familiar weathered face of her father. She dropped the horse, reached her small, trembling arms out toward him, and cried out, "Dada!" The word ripped through Cade's soul. It was clear, desperate, and perfect. "Dada, Dada." Cade reached into the dark space and pulled his daughter into his chest. He buried his face in her dark curls, wrapping his massive arms around her tiny frame. And right there, on the floor of the ruined nursery, the ruthless cattle baron of Montana broke down. Cade Thornton wept. He cried without making a sound, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he held the daughter he thought he had lost, to the silence and the woman who had stood ready to die to protect her. The aftermath of the attack settled over the Ironwood Ranch like a thick, suffocating fog. By dawn, the local sheriff hadn't been called. That wasn't how Cade Thornton handled threats to his blood. Alara stayed in the nursery, holding a thoroughly exhausted Emery until the little girl finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When Alara finally crept downstairs to get a glass of water, she saw something that would alter the course of her life forever. Through the massive living room window, she saw a gathering down by the main barn. Cade was standing in the freezing mud, surrounded by Cassidy and his most loyal ranch hands. Kneeling in the dirt before him were the two men who had broken into the nursery along with Judd Miller, who had been dragged out of his own bed an hour prior. Alara watched her blood running cold as Cade stepped forward. There was no mercy in his posture. He wasn't the grieving father who had wept on the nursery floor just hours ago. He was the kingpin, cold and exacting. She couldn't hear the words exchanged, but she saw Cade raise his fist. The brutality of the beating that followed was systematic and horrifying. It wasn't just a fight, it was an execution of power. By the time Cade stepped back, his knuckles were split and dripping dark blood into the snow, and Judd Miller was a broken, unconscious heap in the mud. Alara backed away from the window, pressing her hand over her mouth. The reality of Cade's world crashed down upon her. She had known he was powerful. She had known he operated in the gray areas of the law. But witnessing the sheer violent ruthlessness of it shattered the illusion she had allowed herself to build. When Cade walked into the kitchen 20 minutes later, he went straight to the sink to wash the blood from his hands. He looked up and saw Alara standing by the island. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound sorrow. He froze the water running over his bruised knuckles. He knew instantly that she had seen. "Alara!" Cade started, his voice a low, rough rasp. "I can't do this, Cade," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't live in this world." Cade turned off the faucet. He gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles turning white. "I did what I had to do to protect my family, to protect you. They brought violence into my home. They threatened my daughter. They will never, ever look in our direction again. I know, Alara said, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. I know why you did it, and I know you'd die for Emery. I'd die for her too, but Cade, I raised my brother from the ashes of a fire. I spent my whole life fighting for peace, for a quiet, safe life. Your world is built on blood and force. If I stay here, I'll always be looking over my shoulder. And Emery will grow up thinking this is normal. I can't be a part of that. Cade stared at her, the gray of his eyes darkening with a desperate, agonizing fear. He stepped toward her, stopping just inches away. I need you, Alara, not just for her, for me. It was the most vulnerable thing Cade Thornton had ever said, but it wasn't enough to erase the blood on the snow. I love her, Alara sobbed quietly, and God help me, I love you, but I have to go. Cade didn't argue. He didn't use his wealth, his power, or his dominant presence to force her to stay. He knew that if he kept her there against her will, he would destroy the very light he loved in her. He stood perfectly still, his jaw locked tight, and let her walk out of the kitchen. Packing took less than 10 minutes. Alara stuffed her few flannels and jeans into her faded canvas duffel bag. But as she slung it over her shoulder and opened her bedroom door, she stopped. Emery was standing in the hallway. The little girl was clutching her stuffed horse, looking at the bag and then up at Alara. Even at 23 months, a child scarred by loss knows exactly what a packed bag means. Emery dropped the horse. She ran to Alara and wrapped her arms around Alara's leg with a crushing, desperate grip. Mama, Mama, no, Emery cried, her voice ringing loud and clear down the hallway. No, Mama, go. The sound shattered Alara's heart into a million irreparable pieces. She dropped her bag and fell to her knees, gathering the sobbing child into her arms. Alara buried her face in Emery's neck, crying just as hard as the little girl. She hummed the country lullaby one last time, her voice cracking on every single note, holding on until Emery's cries softened into exhausted hiccups. Cade stood at the end of the hall watching. He made no move to intervene. He watched the only woman who had ever brought life back into his house peel his daughter's arms from her neck, kiss her forehead one last time, and hand her over to Silas. Alara walked down the stairs, out the heavy oak doors, and climbed into her rattling delivery truck. She didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen Cade Thornton standing in the doorway, looking more defeated than any man had ever made him feel. The silence returned to Ironwood Ranch, but it was infinitely worse this time. Before Emery had simply retreated into herself. Now she actively grieved. The first night she stood by the front door calling Mama until her voice went hoarse. By the second day, she sat in the exact spot in the hallway where Alara used to sing, clutching her horse and refusing to move. By the fourth day, Emery stopped eating. Silas made the apple cinnamon oatmeal exactly the way Alara had, but Emery turned her head away, clamping her mouth shut. Cade tried everything. He sat on the floor with her, pleading in a low, broken voice, "Please, little bird, eat for Dada, please." Emery only looked at the empty doorway, her gray eyes dull and lifeless. The local pediatrician who Cade had flown in by helicopter stood in the hallway with a grim expression. "She's dehydrating, Cade. The trauma of the separation has sent her into a depressive shock. If she doesn't take fluids by tomorrow morning, I have to put her on an IV, and even then, you can't force a child to want to live." Cade stood in his office staring out the window at the 50,000 acres he owned. The vast herds of cattle, the endless timber, the sheer intoxicating power of the Ironwood brand. It was all utterly, completely worthless. He would burn every acre to the ground just to hear his daughter laugh again. Cassidy walked into the office, her boots heavy on the floorboards. She didn't knock. "You're losing her boss," Cassidy said bluntly, crossing her arms, "and you lost the best thing that ever walked through those gates because you couldn't let go of being the king of the valley. Are you really going to let your pride bury your daughter?" Cade turned away from the window. He looked at the heavy leather gun belt resting on his desk. He had worn it every day for 15 years. He reached out, picked up the gun belt, and locked it inside the bottom drawer of his desk. He turned the key and left it there. "Tell Silas to prep my truck," Cade said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute unshakable resolve. "I'm going into town." The bell above the glass door of Mabel's diner chimed a weak, tinny sound that barely cut through the hum of the old neon sign in the window. It was 2 p.m, the dead hour between the lunch and dinner rush. Cade Thornton walked in alone. He hadn't brought Cassidy. He hadn't brought the convoy of black trucks. He wore a faded canvas chore coat, a dust-covered Stetson, and a pair of scuffed work boots. His hips were noticeably empty of the custom leather gun belt he had worn like a crown for 15 years. Mabel was standing behind the counter, wiping down the faded linoleum with a damp rag. When she looked up and saw the cattle baron of Montana standing in her diner, her expression didn't soften. She had lived in this valley long enough to know exactly who and what Cade Thornton was. She threw the rag over her shoulder and planted her hands on her hips, her posture fiercely protective. "Diner's closed, Thornton," Mabel said, her voice rough as sandpaper. "And if you're looking for Alara, you can turn right around and walk back out that door. She's cried enough tears over your ranch." Cade took off his Stetson, holding it by the brim in front of him. He didn't puff out his chest. He didn't try to intimidate her. "Mabel, please," Cade said, his voice stripped of all its usual command. "I just need 5 minutes, that's all." Mabel's eyes narrowed, searching his weathered face for a trick. Whatever she found in the deep, exhausted lines around his gray eyes made her sigh heavily. She nodded toward the back corner booth. 5 minutes. You hurt that girl again, I don't care how many acres you own. I'll take a cast-iron skillet to your skull." "I believe you would," Cade murmured, stepping past the counter. Alara was sitting in the corner booth, staring blankly into a mug of black coffee. She wore her faded denim jacket, her hair pulled back into a messy knot, and the dark circles under her eyes mirrored his own. She looked up as the floorboards creaked under his boots. Her breath hitched her hands, immediately gripping the ceramic mug tighter, but she didn't look away. Cade slid into the vinyl booth across from her. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of the coffee machine behind the counter. "She's dying, Alara," Cade said, his voice cracking on the first syllable. He didn't sugarcoat it. He couldn't. "She hasn't eaten in 4 days. She sits in the hallway waiting for you. If she doesn't take fluids by tonight, the doctor is putting her on an IV." Alara closed her eyes, a sharp, choked sob escaping her lips. A tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. "I'm dismantling it," Cade continued, leaning forward, his large hands resting flat on the table. "I signed the papers this morning. I'm selling the Northern water rights to the State Conservation Board. I'm selling the disputed borderlands. I fired every hand on the payroll who carried a gun instead of a lariat. Ironwood is going to be a cattle ranch, Alara, just a working cattle ranch, nothing more." Alara opened her eyes, staring at him in stunned disbelief. "Cade, your empire, my empire is rotting." Cade interrupted, his voice thick with raw emotion. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small brass key, and slid it across the table. "That's the key to the bottom drawer of my desk. My gun is in it. I locked it away. I'm done fighting for dirt and water, Alara. I'm done being a kingpin. Because none of it matters if the house is silent. None of it matters if I lose my daughter. And if I lose you." Alara stared at the small brass key resting on the scratch table. "I need you," Cade whispered, the hardest, most powerful man in the state, laying his entire soul bare in a roadside diner. "Not just because Emery needs a mother, because I need the only light that's ever made that house feel like a home. Come back to us, please." Alara looked into the storm-gray eyes of the man across from her. She didn't see the ruthless baron who had beaten a man in the snow. She saw a father terrified and broken, offering up everything he had built just for the chance to love her. She picked up the brass key, her fingers closing tightly around it. The drive back to the Ironwood estate felt like the longest journey of Alara's life. When Cade's truck finally parked in front of the massive log house, Alara didn't wait for him to open her door. She jumped out, took the porch steps, 2 at a time, and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The house was deadly quiet. She walked quickly toward the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. And there, sitting on the bottom step, was Emery. The little girl looked terribly fragile, her face pale, her dark curls tangled. She was clutching the worn, stuffed horse against her chest, staring blankly at the floor. Alara dropped her duffel bag. It hit the hardwood with a soft thud. Emery slowly raised her head. For a second, her gray eyes remained wide and unblinking, as if she were afraid her mind was playing a cruel trick on her. But then Alara fell to her knees at the bottom of the stairs, tears streaming freely down her face, and held her arms open wide. Emery dropped the horse. She scrambled down the last step, her little boots slipping on the wood, and threw herself into Alara's embrace with a force that knocked the breath out of both of them. "Mama," Emery sobbed, burying her face into Alara's neck. "Mama, home." "I'm here, baby," Alara wept, crushing the little girl to her chest, rocking her back and forth. "Mama's right here. I'm never leaving you again." Cade stood in the open doorway, the freezing Montana wind whipping his coat around his legs. He stepped inside, closing the door firmly against the cold. He knelt on the floor beside them, wrapping his massive arms around both Alara and his daughter, burying his face in Alara's shoulder. Emery felt her father's arms close around them. She lifted her head from Alara's neck, looked at Cade, and placed one tiny warm hand on his rough cheek. She looked back at Alara, then back at Cade, and spoke a word she had never used before. "Family," Emery whispered, her voice tired but crystal clear. "Mama, Dada, home, family." It had taken 18 months of suffocating silence, a terrifying night attack, and the near collapse of a cattle empire, but the broken pieces of the Ironwood Ranch had finally been put back together. Underscore 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 underscore. 6 months later, the Ironwood estate still sat nestled against the foothills of the jagged Montana mountains. The heavy timber gates were still there, but the armed guards were gone. Instead, the gates stood wide open, welcoming the warm summer breeze. If you drove past the sprawling pastures on a Sunday afternoon, you wouldn't hear the tense, militant hum of a ranch preparing for war. You would hear something far more powerful. You would hear laughter, the joyful, breathless laughter of a 2-year-old girl running barefoot across the lush green grass, chasing a golden retriever puppy. Emery Thornton never stopped talking now. She chattered to the horses, babbled to Silas as he fixed the tractors, and sang off-rhythm country lullabies to her stuffed horse. It was as if she were trying to make up for every silent day she had endured. The Ironwood Ranch had fundamentally changed. Cade had kept his promise. The empire was dismantled, leaving behind a prosperous, honest cattle operation. Sam Alara's brother had transferred his agricultural studies to an online program and was now working under Silas, learning the ropes of legitimate ranch management. Even Mabel had sold her failing diner and moved into the estate's massive kitchen, spending her days arguing good-naturedly with Silas over how to properly brew coffee, filling the house with the scent of fresh baked pie and sizzling bacon. Alara had used the funds Cade had insisted on giving her to start an equine therapy program right there on the ranch. Twice a week, children from all over the county who had suffered trauma came to Ironwood to ride the gentle older horses, finding their own voices in the quiet safety of the barns. On this particular evening, as the Montana sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of violet and gold, Alara sat on the wide wraparound porch. Cade sat beside her on the wooden swing, his arm resting warmly around her shoulders. The smell of pine and sweetgrass hung heavy in the air. "Think Evelyn would recognize this place?" Alara asked softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Cade was quiet for a moment, watching Emery tumble into the grass, giggling wildly as the puppy licked her face. He pulled Alara a little closer, kissing the top of her head. "She'd say it finally sounds like a home," Cade murmured, a genuine, easy smile touching his lips. Emery heard them talking. She scrambled up from the grass, grabbed her stuffed horse, and ran up the porch steps on sturdy, confident legs. She wedged herself onto the swing between Cade and Alara, looking up at them with bright, storm-gray eyes. "Mama Dada," Emery said, pointing proudly to the sunset. "Pretty." "It sure is, little bird," Cade smiled, resting his hand over Alara's. They sat together on the porch, listening to the crickets wake up in the tall grass. They weren't a perfect family. They were a patchwork of scars, grief, and hard-fought battles. But as the darkness settled over the valley, the house behind them glowed with golden light, entirely devoid of the silence that had once haunted its halls. Because sometimes the greatest rescue isn't executed with guns or money. Sometimes a broken family is saved by a delivery girl who knows how to sing, a ruthless kingpin who learns how to let go, and a little girl who finally finds her way home. The end.